Please welcome General Keith Alexander, founder and CEO of IronNet Cybersecurity and former director of the NSA. And please welcome Sean Joyce, cyber consultant and former deputy director at the FBI.
We look a lot better on tape. You know, I see
Don't believe any of it.
I see Jim Rosenthal back there. He's responsible for me starting the company that I did, so thanks, Jim, for that. And it's an honor and privilege to be here with Team8. You know, I think one of the things that we both learned in government is no government agency can do it by itself, no country can do it by itself. It's all about partnerships. And what we thought we would hit tonight is a little bit on our thoughts from a government perspective on 3 or 4 different areas, on the threats, on technology, on cybersecurity products and what that needs to do in terms of public-private partnerships and things like that. So Sean's going to kick it off on the threat, and then I'll do a rebuttal. We got to speed it up.
It's always that way. It's always that way.
Yeah.
I would tell you this. It is amazing what I've learned from government in the transition out into the private sector. It's been about 4 years now. And I always thought things were a lot better. So it's not a gloom and doom, but I actually thought things were a lot better. And I really think there's a great gulf between what the government thinks exists out there and what is really happening. And that involves also the threat. And I would tell you, since my time having left government, it has become incredibly complex and it has changed immensely. So when I look at some of the actors out there now, I'm really concerned about the unpredictables. And by that, I'm talking about Iran and North Korea. So I'm going to let you comment first, and then I'm going to talk about some experiences I've had with those adversaries.
So when you think about North Korea and Iran, in fact, Wall Street and others have seen Iran's attacks in 2012, distributed denial of service attacks. My experience in dealing with some of these nation-state actors is their persistence and their ability to go into networks is something that's almost impossible for a company to individually defend. They can make it really hard, but it's one of the prime reasons that government and industry have to work together. And I think it's one of the things that we need to discuss in a few minutes. With respect to the threat, in 2012, one of the reasons Iran attacked the U.S. was because of sanctions that we put on them in the energy and the finance areas. What did we do just earlier this year? Oh, and we sanctioned North Korea too, and just in case we missed it, we sanctioned Russia. So that ought to make the threat season for us a lot more interesting, and I think we're going to see a series of reconnaissance type attacks, and then if issues with North Korea or Iran grow deeper, I think we're going to see cyber attacks against critical infrastructure.
And the other thing I have seen with many companies now, when you look at something like North Korea, they're doing bank robberies. They're doing digital bank robberies. And when we look at sort of that nation-state threat vector, I don't think we used to think of it that way. And when we look at the repercussions of maybe pulling out of the nuclear pact with Iran, I think we in the private sector have to be concerned about what are those ripple effects. So like I get the usual suspects, China and Russia, and we should talk a little bit about Russia and how they're really using subversion. But I would tell you my greatest concern as we move to the end of 17 and the beginning of 18 are those unpredictables. So really when you look at what North Korea and Iran has done as far as investing in their cyber warriors, and the type of things they're willing to do as a nation state, I think it has really changed the paradigm a little bit in the threat landscape, and we out there have to be prepared.
Yeah, with respect to Russia, when you look at what's going on in Ukraine, I was there 4 weeks ago, and talking to the Ukrainians, you can see that they're still getting attacked every day, both physically and in cyber. It's consistent. If you go to Syria, one of the big problems that the Israelis face right now is an increased presence of Iranian actors in Syria closer to the Golan Heights, and something that's of great interest. So when you start to look at the threats, You can see movement by Russia into Ukraine. They'll use and continue to use cyber tools to go after it. Some of those leaked out and hit our infrastructure and were destructive against several companies. And I think we're going to see attacks by Iran into other countries in the Middle East, Israel, and potentially the US.
So, not just the threat picture, but why don't we talk a little bit about what we see as sort of the government and the private-public sector relationship. So I would tell you that I think it's woefully inadequate. I don't think the government is doing enough. And when I look at the UK, I actually think that's a good model. I actually think they're reaching out a lot more than some of the US agencies. I think it's a very difficult landscape to understand in the US as far as who owns what, right? So in the UK, GCHQ owns both the internal and the external. In the United States, right, the FBI owns the domestic front, and NSA owns the international front. And then you have DHS, right? And then what about that thing called Secret Service? So it's a complex environment, and I think it's one that we need to do a lot better job at. The other thing is the private sector can't do it alone. Without question, it has to be a partnership. One of the things that I am a huge advocate of is actually secondments. So I was 26 plus years with the FBI. I would tell you I would have been a better executive. I would have been a better leader had I had the ability to actually taken a year off and actually worked with a company and understand some of their problems and issues. And I think the other way around, right? Clearances are not a permanent obstacle. And I think the government should be really welcoming a lot of the folks from the private sector for a year secondment too. And by that way, we're going to be able to build trust. And right now, I think there's a real lack of trust in the world, but in this area, there is a lack of trust. And I think collectively, we have to come together to build that trust.
So when you think about the government agencies, one of the reasons that we're up here together is FBI, NSA, and Cyber Command work very closely together. Whether it was something in the US, FBI had the lead, we would come in and support. Overseas, just the opposite. We'd have the lead, they'd support. And my experience was Director Bob Mueller and Sean and the entire team were great to work with. Now, the issue that you have is while you can get government to start to understand their roles and responsibilities, how do they protect you? And the reality is having them come in after you've been attacked and give you what happened is worthless. You don't need the government to come in and say you've been hacked, you lost all your data, you're probably going to lose your job. It's a bad day. You already know that. And you don't need the government. What you would really like to have is where were you before the attack? And so if you think about it, with the change in technology, with the change in threat, how do you work to get information to the government? And this is where I believe we need a lot of work. Sectors need to work together at network speed to share information about what's probing their network. And the reality is we don't think about defending networks like the threat thinks about attacking them. We look at it in an entirely different manner. But if you were to look out there and say, how are we being attacked? What can I tell the government that's not personally identifiable about somebody probing this bank, then this bank, then this bank? The reality is if the government could see that, they would understand when an attack is going to come. I believe that is the most important thing that we can do as a private sector and as a nation and with our allies. The reality is if they want to take down somebody big, they could do it. The interesting part is we could stop it if you could get industry and government to work together and share that information at network speed. So what Sean brought up about getting over the differences between the technology sector, I think critical infrastructure is already there ensuring it, and then setting up that technology to work with government. How do you see those attacks and how do we envision it? If you don't share it with the government, they don't see it, despite what you read in the press. They're not looking at it, they're not going to see it, and it's going to be after the fact. So we have to solve that one issue.
The other thing I'll say is I think the paradigm is different of how historically we looked at the government. We typically, and I think historically, looked at the government as the owner of the most information. And I think in cybersecurity, it's exactly the opposite. And I think a lot of us have difficulty in really understanding what that means. And what I would say to you is the power is in this room. If I would tell you what I've learned since I've retired, it's that you out there have the ability to solve your problems collectively together. Now, is the government a necessary partner? I would say it is, because it helps provide that additional context that's going to protect us all. But unlike anything else, the private sector is the holder of the most information. So how do we bring those mechanisms together? So when I look at the ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, I don't actually believe in a sector-specific ISAC. I don't think a cyber threat is actually sector-specific. So how do we leverage that? Like, I think initially that was a good idea, but I would venture to you a lot of the malware out there is sector agnostic, right? So how do we come together and say and share that information? Because I would tell you from my experience, there are some ISACs that function very, very well. We all know, right, the FS ISAC I think does a great job. It's the most mature ISAC, but what about all those others? Right? We have the MS ISAC, but what about all those other 16 sector ISACs? And how are we working to bring all that together? Right? How many of the folks, going back to what General Alexander was mentioning, right? How many of you run legacy systems? Right? I bet almost every hand in the room probably, right? Do you think the government understands what that means? When they say you have to patch, right? Do you think the government understands what that means? And if it's a critical one patch, doing that in 24, 36 hours? So this is where I mean that we have got to come together. We've got to work a lot harder to really bring that solution collectively. You know, I hear over and over about when I go to companies on a breach and they're talking about, well, I don't want to go to the government because they're going to tell the regulator, or I don't really trust them. And I would tell you, in my term at the FBI, there wasn't a single occasion where we actually told the regulator about a breach or did not keep the information confidential. But I would tell you this, in the same sense, I think the FBI can do a better job reaching out, and the FBI needs to understand it's not always a two-way street. Sometimes the company just wants to be in receive mode. And then also understanding the company's understanding that if you provide that information, that's going to enable the government, the NSA, the FBI to actually help you in a much better and more effective way.
I want to share with you a meeting that we had with President Trump in the energy sector, because it directly addresses one of the issues. And Jim, it kind of goes back to that question. You said, well, we've got the banks being protected, but what about the underlying energy sector? I have really been impressed with the way the energy sector has jumped on a collective solution for cybersecurity for the sector. And one of the CEOs of that sector briefed the president. I actually switched his chair, so he's sat facing the president, and I sat next to him, switched that out. There's humor there. And yeah, there's a lot more that went on. I'll tell you the interesting part. President Trump had read the entire package. He understood all the questions. Now, there was no press there. He asked all the right questions. He asked how he could help, and he gave great guidance. It was a great meeting. It went an hour. And the issue was, so how are you going to protect the energy sector? And I think Galena and company working this from Clarity and us and others. How do you do that? And the answer is, you've got to help them have a ability to see what's hitting their network, and then the ability to share that among companies in the sector. So you begin to build, think of it as like an air defense picture. but a cyber defense picture for the sector. And this has been a great journey with that sector, and something that the president could then turn around to Tom Bossert and to DHS and to DOD and others and say, okay, how do we help? What do you need? How do we get this going? I think that shows a pathway for what we can do by sectors, by critical infrastructure, with our government, and for the good of the country. With that, I'll let you have the remaining time. You're welcome.
12 seconds or less.
10 now.
And I won't mention President Trump. So going back to that, I would just say that I do think the administration wants to do more. I'm not sure it knows how, right? So I think it is really incumbent upon us to come up with those creative thoughts and ideas to make a difference. But I would just tell you this, if I had a closing message, it's up to us. It's not up to the government. It's up to what we collectively decide to do together and with each other and to build that trust and share that information.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.